Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I'm joined by Doctors Scott Keith, Adam Francisco, and a guest today, Dr. Dan Dean. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
You've been on the show before briefly. It was a while ago.
It's been a while.
Over a year and a half ago, actually, during the apologetics series, which always seems kind of like close, but is actually pretty far away now that this is the third year of podcasting that we've been doing. But it's good to have you back. And listeners who have been listening for the whole time or go back and listen to the whole catalog and things like that might remember that you joined us to do the philosophical apologetics episode where we did classical apologetics and philosophies. And that's because you're a doctor of philosophy and you teach philosophy right now.
That is correct.
And so maybe people will pick up on this, but we're going to do an episode on philosophy again today. And it's not necessarily in the same vein as last time where we were focusing mostly on different philosophical methods in apologetics that have been used throughout history. But today I thought it would be valuable to do an episode on the impact or relationship between theology and philosophy. And this kind of came to me as I was editing an episode that went out recently that we actually recorded a while ago with another professor from Concordia, Dr. Russ Don, on natural law. And that episode had a lot of, obviously philosophy in it. And so I thought, hey, the description of this show is apologetics, theology, and church history. Well, I think a lot of the overlap happens with philosophy too. And we could probably add that as a fourth category that kind of undergirds the show. And so today we're going to address that formally. But before we jump into that, I just wanted to remind everybody that the Thinking Fellows is part of the 1517 podcasting network. We're a network of 8 shows that's growing. So we'll probably be around 10 shows pretty soon here with some ones that are in the works. And you can find out all those shows at 1517legacy.com/podcasts. The goal of the network is to just get a lot of shows or as much content as we can together that is Christ-centered, that covers as many topics as possible. And the Thinking Fellows is one element of that as we sort of do formal doctrine and history and apologetics and now in this case philosophy. But there are shows in there that do more cultural intersection, that do biblical exegesis. There's all sorts of topics there for people to listen to. So you can go, once again, to 1517legacy.com/podcast. That's also going to be linked up in the show notes, so you can take a direct link there. Okay, so we can sort of jump full force into this, but I gave you a little introduction, Dan, but maybe you could just introduce yourself. We have a lot of new listeners since last time you were on the show.
All right. Yeah, my name's Dr. Daniel Dean. I work at Concordia Irvine, where I'm basically in charge of running freshman philosophy in our core curriculum, or I guess it's now called Enduring Questions and Ideas curriculum. And that means I teach a lot of intro. But I am housed in the theology department, which is a little unusual for a person with a philosophy degree. Usually they're housed in arts and sciences. But Concordia, again, kind of playing off this idea of theology and philosophy working together and sometimes not working together, sees it fit to put the philosopher in with theologians, probably so they can watch me. Because, again, I've probably made this joke before, but as they like to remind me up at the college, philosophers are usually at the root of all heresy.
What was that joke you made before the show, Adam? We should put them all in a box.
Yeah, I actually got this from somebody else, though, a scientist who says philosophers are useful, but every once in a while, so you keep them locked up in a box until you need them.
Then you let them out.
But that's the relationship between philosophy and theology, though, historically, yeah. Right? Yep. Philosophy is a handmaiden, a servant to theology. At least that's the way it was originally conceived.
Yeah, we've talked briefly on episodes before about the limitations of philosophy. There's some drastic quotes from Luther regarding philosophy or philosophies in relation to theology and things like that, and the error that can go there. But obviously, if you listen to the show, we also talk about the benefits or even some of the necessity of engaging in philosophical thought, or that theology definitely has impact on that as well. And so I thought we would just kind of get into that a little bit today. And so I think Adam brings up a good starting point, the use of philosophy, magisterial versus ministerial, and maybe we can kind of flesh out those meanings too there for our listeners.
Yeah, so when I teach this in the intro class at the university, I just have them parse out the words. Within the word magisterial use, you can sort of hear the word magister, or which just means to rule over, or a ruler, right? Ministerial, you can hear the word minister in there, somebody who serves. And so when you're thinking the difference between magisterial use and ministerial use, you're simply thinking of whether the thing itself, in this case philosophy, is ruling over, right, the subject, which is theology, or if it's ministering to or helping the subject, which is, in this case, theology. And that's, it's easy to say, it's harder to do. That the line there where you're using your God-given reason, right, and your ability to think things through and even to apply things that you've learned from the field of philosophy to the field of theology, where that stops in your reasoning, in your theological reasoning, and where it begins, that's a harder line to find than a lot of people might think. And to be honest with you, if you're thinking of it in terms of sort of Reformation history and theology, where that line is really what separates a lot of the Protestant denominations, I think. I mean, at the end of the day, where that line serves as the core difference between, say, Reformed and Lutheran specifically, on things like their view of the Lord's Supper, perhaps even their view on election and things like that. So it's not just as clean as saying, hey, are you using philosophy magisterially or ministerially? Because certainly if you were explaining that to the Reformed, in our sense even, they'd say, oh, of course we're using it ministerially. While we would say, we think you're crossing over that line. And so this is a good conversation to have, and it's a very old conversation, as Adam referred to. Where does it stop and where it begin? I mean, one of the biggest reactions that Luther had during the Reformation was to the scholastics, right? And the accusation was they were using sort of Aristotelian philosophy gleaned from Aquinas to determine theology and theological practices without relying solely on the scriptures. So, but having said that, one would have to acknowledge that Luther, of course, used reason.
Yeah.
When he was making his theological propositions.
Right. And so the age-old question, the way we deal with this topic in philosophy, not jumping so much into theology per se, but is that question of faith and reason, and how do the two actually interact appropriately. The theological categories are ministerial and magisterial, right? But I mean, this goes back into the ancient church fathers with Tertullian and asking the question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? In terms of how do these two disciplines interact? And in some sense, it is a contemporary problem insofar as we've become uber specialized, right? So, I mean, what does a philosopher do?
I think
asks the philosopher.
I think that's good. That's a good point to bring up. I mean, even if you were to look at, say, Luther and Melanchthon, they were multidisciplinary in their approach to the university, right? Melanchthon taught languages, he taught theology, he taught philosophy, he taught mathematics, he taught history. I mean, history, not was a sort of evolving or developing field at the time, right, Adam? Mm-hmm. But I mean, he was one of the sort of forerunners of teaching it as a
and the philosophers that they would have been dealing with were the ancients,
correct?
Right?
Yeah.
And there is the sense. I mean, I've been reading a lot of Oswald Bayer recently, and he's got a wonderful kind of take on this in terms of theology, where he says the discipline of theology is a discipline that's caught in between myth and metaphysics, right? And I only bring this up to suggest that the contemporary philosopher is maybe. I mean, I don't know where we stand in terms of the theological discipline, because most philosophers in this day and age aren't offering a kind of complete worldview in the way that maybe Aristotle and Plato were, where the end aim was the good life, right? And so this notion of if I got to get my life in order philosophically in order to attain goodness or something like that, which the Reformation throws a huge monkey wrench in there, because none of the ancient philosophers dealt with this thing called sin, right? I mean, Aristotle mentions it briefly as something called akrasia, which is a weakness of will, and it's in Nicomachean Ethics, and it's it's a couple paragraphs. He doesn't even develop it, and Plato doesn't even really deal with it. It was more contemporary philosophers who suggested that Plato has this kind of view of a unity of virtue, which means if you know the good, you will do the good, which bumps right up into Romans 7 negatively.
Yeah.
Right? So as a philosopher, a professional philosopher, I have always strayed away from what other philosophers of religion have started to do, people like William Lane Craig, where they start talking about a philosophical theology. And there you get kind of, again, that metaphysics side of Bayer coming back, where it's saying, hey, you know what? What could God foreknow? I mean, these are the questions that philosophers of religion are asking. What is it possible for God to know? Right? And most of us kind of go, that's a question you guys ask? Yeah. Right? Well, I mean, why not? Right? But the only answer you can give is to start speculating.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start speculating, then you're going to start running into the problem of that I mentioned earlier. Speculation is going to lead to unbiblical responses to saying the question like, what could God possibly know? Right? Does God know what you're going to do tomorrow?
Well, and epistemologically, it's problematic because, like you said, even the philosopher's answer to that is going to be speculative. It's not testable in a real sense, unless, in some way, shape, or form, you can verify that God of whom you're speaking entered into the world and told you the answer.
Right.
So.
You mentioned William Lane Craig and his philosophical theology, his dealings with free will and foreknowledge and all these other things.
Something
Is
called
it-
a sedity, too, right?
Yeah,
Theity.
yeah. I wonder, it seems to me that Craig does most of that for apologetic purposes. To be sure, it's speculative, but isn't he, it seems like he's just trying to think in light of the problem of evil, where you've got these three things that just seem to not fit. Reality of evil, an all-loving God, and an all-powerful God. And isn't he just sort of dealing with the question of foreknowledge and all these other things speculatively to help us clean up our language about it? I mean, are there a lot of Christian philosophers? I mean, I know there are some who really are trying to build a worldview from a natural theology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, William Lane Craig is definitely more apologetically minded.
Yeah.
But what's interesting with him, because he has PhDs in philosophy and then he has another PhD in theology, he really is, at times, his apologetics will push him into questions of theology that he thinks he needs to have like tight, clear answers to in order for his apologetics to work, and then vice
Right,
versa. So
right.
then he'll start doing a little theology and be like, oh shoot, I need to kind of answer certain questions about God so I can better solve the problem of evil or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think Lutherans, that's a very kind of reformed, even a Catholic move in terms of trying to provide reason can.
Purely philosophical.
to be sure, it's like neo-scholasticism.
Neo-scholasticism,
It's
sure.
Metaphysics. I have a soft spot. Remember, I think the last
I was here, yeah.
time I have a soft spot
Aquinas.
for it.
Yes.
Because you look at it in its context, it makes sense that they're doing that stuff.
Yeah.
So I think with the Christian philosophers in the Middle Ages, the scholastic theologians, they're asking these questions not just purely out of speculation, but because they're living in a day and age where the beliefs that have been handed down to them, they believe, but they want to make sure that there's good reason to believe these things, that it's grounded in something a little more secure than just mom and dad told me or the church told me or whatever it is. So that's why I have a little soft spot for it, because given the context,
Yeah. And that's-
now it goes bonkers when it
Right.
gets into, I guess bonkers is okay. When they're asking questions like, is God, if God's all powerful, can he create a rock that's
Bigger than
heavy
he
for
can
him to
lift?
lift?
Yeah.
That's
Or a
that's
burrito
silly.
too hot, you could eat it.
Yeah. Or what happens when
That's the California version of that
version.
question.
after the elements are consecrated at the Lord's Supper, if a little
Yeah.
crumb falls and a mouse eats it, what happens? I mean,
Right.
that's odd.
So
But whatever.
So this is why I was really struck by Bayer's kind of idea that theology, and I think this would work with philosophy too, is stuck between myth and metaphysics, because the problem of the philosopher is that we tend to be an arrogant bunch, where because we thought so carefully about something like divine properties and foreknowledge, that the answers we give, and we've got really great reasons for them, is like equated with like a metaphysical truth or an absolute truth. And we forget that it's really just a kind of construction that we've overlaid on top of kind of the world, or
Internally coherent.
it's internally coherent, but it is overlaid upon a world that doesn't actually play perfectly with that construction, right? And so for a Lutheran doing philosophy, one, I think, always has to be a little nervous when we get into kind of, because neo-scholasticism is quite sexy, because it gives us an entire system, and we can put pieces in, and it allows us to move pieces around, and it's beautiful in that regard. I mean, there's an aesthetic value to it. But we have to be careful that we don't allow that to become our like kind of new God. I mean, this is where Luther, I think, is really good with kind of First Commandment issues. And the philosopher is always going to be tempted that way.
Yeah, I mean, the Lutheran or Luther's critique of scholasticism and so on makes good sense. Philosophical speculation, worldview construction, all that stuff. I'm not so interested. But I am also not interested in necessarily just critiquing it,
right?
Just because it's philosophical or speculative or whatever, because everybody speculates, right? On may not be philosophical speculation; it might be scientific or whatever it is. So and with regard to philosophy and Christianity, it's interesting. You mentioned Tertullian, who asked the question back in I guess it was the first half of the 3rd century, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? And he gives the answer, nothing. And Clement of Alexandria says everything. And that sort of set up the conversation historically in Christianity, where you had to take sides, it seems, which is strange, because if you go back before those two, the church fathers, you go back to the New Testament, you find, like, in terms of the narrative and in terms of the doctrine, there's some interplay between Christianity and philosophy. Think of Paul at Mars Hill when he's debating, actually kind of forced to go up to the Areopagus to make an account for the hope within him before, as Luke records, Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, the big philosophical schools of that day. I always find it interesting that Paul quotes their own poets, as Luke records.
Yep.
And now, sure, God could have given Paul that knowledge.
Or
directly.
he knew them.
Or Paul studied it. Paul studied philosophy, because philosophy, in way, it's a handmaiden to theology. Philosophy is vital to know for the Christian engaging the public arena. So you know where those open windows are, where that common ground, at least terminological common ground might be. And at the same time, I just want to interrupt you again. You also find Paul saying things like, don't be taken captive to vain philosophies and fundamental elements and so on and so forth. So there's, like, the New Testament doesn't force you to take a side in that debate that Tertullian and Clement set up.
Good. So check this out, because I love the Colossians. The Colossians, I don't actually go to Mars Hill anymore, only because it does seem to be a little bit on that one-sided apologetic front, and it's good. But Colossians 2 is awesome, because Colossians 2 gives you the warning. Beware of vain philosophies. But then, right, so the philosopher definitionally is the lover of wisdom, right? And you go down in Colossians, just another couple. It might be in Colossians 3. I forget exactly. I'd have to go look it up. But you get down in Colossians a little bit further, and it says, "But walk with wisdom towards the outsider." Right. So beware of wisdom, but walk in wisdom.
I think you need to make Luther does this too, and we don't. And it's probably the theologian. I mean, two things I wanted to say, but Luther makes a distinction between reason, right? The ratio, or the using of reason, using wisdom, and applying particular philosophies to your theology. And I think his battle, I just finished doing a readings class with the MA program on Luther's epistemology. We used David Anderson's book on the subject, and Anderson does a very good job of pointing out that, Luther's problem with this conversation is that he believes from the scriptures that our sinful minds, right, the old Adam mind, can only know those things that are of us, of the world out here, right? Those things that we can go out and observe, and those things that are natural to us from Romans 1 and 2, the law, right? So we can speak pretty abundantly regarding the law and apply a lot of, our natural reason and even philosophies in a sense to that. But once you get beyond those things, so those things that we cannot know naturally, specifically speaking of the gospel, right, or of why God had to send Christ to die for us type thing, that's where this all falls short in the relationship between philosophy and theology. So he's not one actually to say that there's no application here. There's no need for philosophy within the discipline of doing theology, although he wouldn't have spoken that way. This was an integrated thing for him. But his worry was, I think what Paul's worry is in Colossians 2, is not that you'll use the practice of philosophy or the love of wisdom and, where your reason can bring you there, but that you will be beholden to a particular philosophy, we'd say these days, all-encompassing worldview, and then try to apply or sort of smush that worldview onto Christianity and make it into something that it's not.
Mm-hmm. To the detriment of the gospel.
Yeah, and Luther's point is always that's because we are all naturally theologians of glory, right? We will always do that to the detriment of the gospel, 100% of the time. And I think to me, that's sort of that's the crux point with this. We were talking about it even earlier before we were recording that one of my biggest frustrations is theologians who have no training in philosophy because they make the most egregious logical errors as they're sort of reasoning through things. And you can sometimes see this, not that I love the exegetes, but you can sometimes see this particularly with exegetes who go on to make, sort of jump conclusions about what the text is saying that it hasn't said, instead of just, telling me clearly what the text says in the original language and sort of giving me the best translation and context that you can, right? To jump beyond that, and certainly systematicians do this all the time too, that you make a conclusion that's not based on the text, and worse yet, isn't even logically thought out or good or coherent. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of suffers from both errors, right? It's not in the text clearly, it's speculation, and the speculation itself isn't even very logical because of a lack of philosophical training oftentimes.
Yeah. Yeah, this is precisely why I wanted to do this episode, because of the balance, I think, necessary because of those frustrations. You've been talking about this for weeks, and I think part of it has to do with some interactions with students and things like that who, not only have no philosophical background, but like almost refuse to get one, things like that. And the struggle with not becoming too adherent to a particular philosophy as we do theology. So I think this is a great jumping off point to go to our break, and then we'll wrap this episode up. Hello there, and welcome to our break. Today we're going to talk about the Here We Still Stand conference that's going to be going on this October. This is now an annual conference for us. Last year we thought it may be sort of a one-off, just a celebration of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Well, things went so well, and we had so much interest for people who wanted to attend again or couldn't attend last year, who wanted to come to a new conference, that we found a way to do this every year now. And so it's going to be same location. It's at the Hyatt Regency Mission Bay and Spa in San Diego, California. The dates are going to get me, though.
October 18 to 20, 2018.
There we go. So if I know there's been a lot of listener interest in coming to this. Some people are waiting for discounts to pop up again like they did last year. You're going to be somewhat in luck and somewhat out of luck. We're not going as deep with the discounts this year because we're already close to selling out of this conference, if you're listening to this now.
Yeah, we're expected to sell out by the beginning of July.
Yeah, and this episode is second week in June, I think, if everything goes distributed as planned right now. And so what that means is that you're like on your last chances to buy this. The Thinking Fellows have a discount code for this that gets you 20% off. There will there have not been and there will not be any lower discounts than this available. So if you're like waiting for the cheapest rock bottom price, this is it. The code that you're going to put in at checkout at the Here We Still Stand website is TF18. I will put that in the show notes with a direct link to the registration page, so you don't really have to worry about it. It's herewestillstand.org if you want to type it in yourself. But again, the easiest way to get that is just to click the link in the show notes of this episode, either on your phone or from our website. TF18, 20% off. That's the lowest price you'll get to come to this conference. How many days? It's
October 18th through 20.
there we go. So two days with a podcasting pre-conference that first day that we will be part of. So you can come watch the Thinking Fellows record live, as well as most of the other shows at the 1517 Podcasting Network. It's a lot of shows now too. So it's 8. So it's like, and we're squeezing in as much as we can. So that pre-day is going to be a full day of podcasting. You can come see every show on the network practically, record a live episode. This year we are backing up the recording so we don't have an issue like there was last year.
So not all 8 of the podcasts.
No, we can't
will be
fit
able to
everything in
record,
the same
but
day.
quite a few of them. Ringside will be up first. Let the Bird Fly. 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. Front Porch with the Fitzes, who's not part of the network, but they're friends who are involved with the Here We Still Stand. And then Virtue in the Wasteland and Thinking Fellows.
Yep. So we're the last show again. That'll be there. We had a packed room last time, which was really cool. It was somewhat frightening because we're used to doing the show just by ourselves in like a closed
Back
door.
then, a garage.
In a closed garage, and then
Dark garage.
all of a sudden there's like floodlights on us and like 300 people looking at you. So that was crazy. But we'd love to do it again. It was great to get the audience involved with questions. If you want to be part of that, you should really start planning now because there's not going to be tickets left for much longer.
This year we might have to put makeup on. Caleb's used to it, but
The two of us.
yeah.
That's a foreign experience.
Oh, I'll get you for that later. In editing, I'll just like make you say something. Okay.
It'll make you say, I'm used to it.
So as we get back on track here to round out this episode about the relationship or interplay between philosophy and theology, I always think it's helpful, and this is just, to me, a core element of our show, to help provide some resources on this. Whether, I think for this episode, maybe, as we've said, the importance of having perhaps a basic understanding of philosophy. So maybe some, Dan, you could help with, since you do so much intro to philosophy, helping people maybe say, I want to get schooled a little bit with some reading there. And then we could also maybe dig deep into some books that do this faith and reason kind of tension. So it's all yours, Dan.
All right. Yeah, I mean, really, if you just want to start with reading philosophy, the best thing to do is go to the primary sources. Pick up a little book on Plato, pick up a little book on Aristotle, and have at it. That could be a little difficult. So there are a couple nice, they're not introductions, but just kind of histories of philosophy. And Adam actually might have some good suggestions on stuff that's more recent. I tend to still work with kind of the traditional stuff that helped me get through grad school, like Copleston's History of Philosophy. There's another one. Let me see if I can look it up really quickly.
I think again, I say this all the time, but I like the Oxford University Press very short introductions on, you can pick them up on, particular branches of philosophy, on particular philosophers, and they're very good.
Yeah, if you want a tour in contemporary philosophy that drives more towards a worldview, Jim Sayers, The Universe Next Door.
Right.
I think I've recommended it before.
Yep.
I mean, that is a fantastic work.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with that one either. That is a really, really good book for somebody who has never taken a philosophy course in their life. It's nice, tight, compact.
You know who's experiencing a revival is, I think I said that wrong, but Marcus Aurelius. Everybody's reading Marcus Aurelius. And I think it's because the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, General
likes him.
Mad Dog Mattis, always reads Marcus Aurelius. But I've seen my one social media account, Instagram, tons of Marcus Aurelius.
People are taking a picture of the book or something?
He's a Stoic, right?
Yeah.
Because Stoicism is on the rise in sort of the Min movement.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
The Stoic back. The Stoics are back. Yeah.
Yeah, like the guy on Art of Manliness. I'm pretty sure he thinks he's a Stoic, and a lot of the books, the authors that he has on his show, sort of say they ascribe to a Stoic philosophy of some kind, and it's very much on the rise.
The teaching company has I think it's Neil Robinson. The last name's Robinson.
sure.
Don't remember the first name.
History of Ideas.
He's got a lecture entitled "The Stoic Bridge to Christianity," and argues in a way that, at least for the first couple centuries of Christianity, Stoicism was Stoicism coupled with a Platonism, a Neoplatonism, if you will, was the philosophy that, as Augustine put it, Luther put it, gets as close as you can get to Christianity, though it's still a mile away, but it's much closer than, say, like Aristotelianism or something, which is interesting, considering Aristotelianism comes back several centuries later, and that it surpasses the Platonism that
I'm not.
informs much of
I know.
Christianity.
I know Luther loves Cicero, and I know he's not technically a
Melanchthon
Stoic.
too.
He's not technically a Stoic, but I mean,
He says in his work on obligations, I draw chiefly from the Stoics, but not
Right.
exclusively.
the Stoics are for ethical reasons they're nice because what they do, and this because I think it fits in nicely with Luther's idea of vocation, which is probably why they picked up on that.
Yeah.
Because for the Stoic, you don't necessarily have an overarching ethical theory that you apply to every given situation that's going to give you the exactly precise answer to do and for the action to carry
It's not
out.
prescriptive.
It's generally prescriptive,
But not specifically.
But the prescriptions are going to come about due to the relationships you find yourself in.
Yeah.
And which is why I think it works really well with the Lutheran theology. Because again, if you're thinking about vocation and your duties to my neighbor or something like that, that changes and shifts. And the Stoics, because the kind of way the universe works is outside of yourself, and you are just a kind of cog in this gigantic machine world that you can't control who you're going to come into contact with. They kind of adjusted their ethics depending on the people that you actually were practically involved with daily. And I think that's also why it's made such a resurgence, because it doesn't. Stoicism isn't a top-down philosophy. It's a philosophy that comes from the inside out, right? Because you're in a world that you can't control, and if the economy's crumbling or everything's crumbling around you, Stoicism is kind of powerful because it says, what's the one thing you can control?
Yeah.
Your responses to that stuff.
Yeah.
So buck up and get better.
Yeah.
Right? But there's no cosmic sense of getting better because the world is going to deal you your deck of cards and you're just kind of stuck with it.
Yeah.
And there's divine providence things that might work with that too. But I think that's probably why they were so attracted to the ethics without having looked into what Luther and Melanchthon actually say too much on that. It's tempting. The Stoics are also, this is nerdy philosophy, but the Stoics also developed the first sentential logic. So, meaning, like, Aristotle develops a kind of categorical logic. All S's are P's and things like that, where you're dealing with entire sentences. The Stoics were the first to actually kind of do what we do now in logic, which is kind of to pull a sentence apart and deal with the actual kind of formation of the particular sentences.
What do the words mean?
Yeah. And to play with it, again, it plays with it in context a little bit more. But that's if you're a philosophy student and you go on and get a BA in philosophy, you will have to take a predicate, what we call a predicate calculus, which sounds really fancy. Just means you're going to do a logic on sentences.
Yeah.
And the Stoics started that.
Interesting.
It's fascinating. Yeah. It
You
wasn't well
finally
developed.
taught me something. Just kidding.
I earned my place out of the room.
That's scary.
My drill instructor back in the day, over 20 years ago now, actually over 25 years ago, used to always say, "Embrace the suck, guys."
Yep.
And it's only very recently that I realized that guy was a Stoic.
He didn't even know it.
Yeah.
Or he did.
Yeah.
I always, when we do this, it's very heady reading. But if people want to really dive in from a Lutheran perspective or from a Luther perspective on this issue, I always recommend David Anderson's Martin Luther: The Problem of Faith and Reason. I mean,
The only problem with that book
Uh-oh.
is he doesn't translate any of the Latin.
I said it's heady.
I know, but he leaves these
Is that his
gigantic.
dissertation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why that happened. I've been I didn't run into this a lot in undergrad, but for the MA research I've been doing, you just run into more and more books where that's
don't translate it.
that's the thing,
And that's fine.
I'm
But
really glad I have it, but not a lot of people
that
do.
would be maybe a nice little 1517 project to actually translate out that Latin so a common
Yeah,
person
Caleb.
could
Yeah,
approach
Caleb.
it.
What do you all think about Brian Gerrish's Grace and Reason and Siegbert Becker's The Foolishness of God?
I've read the Becker one a while ago, and I thought it was good. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it deals with this conversation at least responsibly, and I think because sometimes the danger in this conversation is to not give the philosophers any credit. And from the theologian side, I mean, the danger is always not to give the philosophers any credit in the doing of theology. And I think he avoids that wholly. And on the whole doesn't go too far, but it's been a while since I read it.
Yeah, I don't think I've read the Beckett or Becker.
Becker, yeah.
So
But
the
Gerrish's
guy
Grace
Valpo.
and Reason I've always thought was a really good
Yeah.
sort of historian's approach to Luther's view of faith and reason, if you will.
But is that the one though that comes out unfriendly though? Comes out a little unfriendly towards reason. Grace and Reason.
I don't think so,
What-
because
what's
it's just
his thesis?
Gerrish saying he's just trying to describe Luther.
Okay.
So, but like with Scott with Becker, it's been a while since
Right.
I've read that book. So,
I'm not sure we do. I mean, I don't think Lutherans.
when are you going to write a book?
I know I'm working on it. I don't think contemporary Lutherans have done faith and reason well.
Nope.
It's sad, as I was Scott and I were talking earlier this morning, it's kind of sad because if you're a student of philosophy and you're a Lutheran, you're going to get pulled either towards a neo-scholasticism or you're going to get pulled towards the Reformed.
Interesting.
We haven't really carved out enough space intellectually to even allow a Lutheran to kind of go through graduate school, go through a BA, an MA, a PhD in philosophy, and this is going to sound a little weird, but feel comfortable with their Lutheranism. Like the discipline itself is
Yeah.
going to start tugging you in these directions. And it simply is because we just don't have Lutheran voices out there.
Well, you may always be uncomfortable with your Lutheranism
should.
in philosophy
Yeah.
because, I mean, philosophy is going to pull you towards answers that you might not have
Right.
from a Lutheran perspective. Especially if you're speaking of sort of overarching truths as it pertains to those things that you can't know empirically. That type of speculation. I mean, like we said, everybody speculates, but that type of speculation is hard. Whereas I think the Reformed, they're
willing to take it farther.
Well, their system is based on logic so much to the degree that you can sort of, even with sort of presuppositionalism and whatnot, you can explain away, in a sense, some of those what we would just call maybe inconsistencies that you will never know the answer to by saying, well, you just can't understand it.
Right. So here's
outside of this.
Here's like an example, right? So I always get these two confused. The formal principle.
That's your source of information.
So that would be like scripture for
Yeah.
us, right? Okay. So your material principle then
Is the
right,
thing.
is the thing. So the
Scripture are our feelings. Just kidding.
so the
what our
form,
pastor says.
so the Reformed's formal principle, right, is the sovereignty of God, and that does make its way down into their philosophy, right? But we don't have. I've never seen. And again, I'm not a philosopher of
Their
religion.
material principle.
Their material.
Their formal principle would still be the Bible.
Got it. Material principle, the one that is the thing,
Yeah.
right, is sovereignty of God. And that creeps its way down into its epistemology, the metaphysics and all. And
Right.
that's what you mean by the logic. Like they got to fit it into this kind of logical box because a sovereign God wouldn't be inconsistent, right?
Yeah, and there's an internal coherency to what
Sure.
they say that it's very appealing.
But outside of what Oswald Bayer has done in the little I've read in theology, I haven't seen somebody take the material principle of Lutheranism and investigate how it kind of creeps its way down, not just through theology, but through knowledge or the disciplines of the academy
Yeah.
itself.
I think it's harder.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's harder. I mean, anyway, the other thing I was going to say is you said that students of philosophy, Christian students of philosophy, they're drawn towards Roman Catholicism, scholasticism, or to the Reformed. And I'm sure there is, because it's happening in Lutheranism too. I mean, there was a time in Lutheranism, 17th century, where there was a Lutheran scholasticism, which did really attempt to answer all of these questions, based much more on Aristotle and natural law and that type of thing. At the same time, this was happening in the Reformed too, with Protestant scholasticism. is that movement big again within the Reformed world and the philosophers, or is it back to a type of scholasticism?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. The Reformed
epistemologists wouldn't fall into
No,
that
no. The
category,
Reformed
right?
epistemology are going to be separate from the scholastics, But the Planning again calls his kind of epistemology an Aquinas Calvin model. So like he blends the Catholics and the Reformed together to get his kind of model of epistemology. The Reformed tend to be a little bit more systematic in terms of keeping their disciplines separate. In terms of, if I'm a philosopher of the Reformed tradition, I might be a metaphysician. So I'm doing metaphysics, but I'm going to do a metaphysics that's in line with this idea that God is sovereign over all. And the Catholics, I don't know how neo-scholasticism works. I mean, Edward Fesser is probably the best bet to go learn about neo-scholasticism because he's just so dang smart and knows that stuff inside and out. But I have not read his work to see exactly how neo-scholasticism works. I do know, though, having gone through the PhD at a place that had a surprising amount of Christians in the program, they were all tempted. None of them wanted to. They were all tempted toward either doing things a little bit more scholastically, or they were just flat out kind of like, I'm Reformed and I'm doing it, according to the way Planning and some other guys do it at like Notre Dame, which is odd again because that's a Catholic school, but there's a stronghold there, right? And it takes on. It's almost. This is going to sound really bad. It takes on almost like a Mormonish cultish status, where it's like, how they're going to kind of answer questions because they're coming
it's
at
ideological, right?
Because that's the historian ideological term,
comprehensive,
and it works. And so if you're talking to a Catholic, you kind of know how he's going to answer questions. If you're talking to a Reformed, you kind of know how they're going to answer questions that are philosophical in nature, right? And you can throw them. It's fun because you can even throw them little trails like you do with a Mormon that will kind of kick them off the narrative. They tend to be a little bit smarter at getting it back on the narrative though than any of the Mormons I've dealt with, but. It's frustrating. It was really frustrating because what kept me grounded through all my philosophical training was the actual historical apologetic.
Right.
That was the only thing. If I did not have that historical apologetic, I would have been, like Descartes says in Meditation 2, I would have been lost in a whirlpool because everything gets kicked up and you get thrown around in philosophy in a way. This is just grad training, but you get thrown around in ways that just are painful existentially. And that's where the danger, I think, comes, because then you start looking at Reformed epistemology and like, well,
there's a branch and
they talk about
down
Jesus.
In the river and you grab it.
They talk about Jesus, and so you kind of grab it and you imbibe it, or you go the scholastic route because again, that works too. You're like, wow, that pulls me out of this whirlpool of doubt. It was the historical facticity. Is that a word?
Yes.
Okay. It was the historical facticity of Christ, though, that kept me even doubting those branches as they were thrown to me. Because I would see what Planning was doing and think, like, you know what? He's actually kind of undercutting my ability to say that Jesus Christ died and rose again in an objective manner.
Right.
Or the scholastics, who I didn't get too deep into because I just didn't. But again, Christ isn't front and center in that system. And so when I started like comparing even like the branches, I was like, well, I can't go those routes. Right? So I don't know. There's not going to be. I would be the first to say there's going to be no set way that Lutherans would do philosophy, but it would be nice. And again, I guess it's my task to kind of help create this. How can we promote the lifeline a little bit better so that when the students get out, particularly seminary students as they go to seminary, right? Philosophy students, everybody, so that they can be grounded in how about this? Protection from the ideologies. Right? So that as they go out into school, they don't just start grabbing these things. Because again, if you're looking at InterVarsity and Campus Crusade for Christ, they're going to be in one.
It's called Crew now because you can't use the word crusade anymore.
Oh, wow. Is it really?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right? But they're going to be promoting this on the side as your kid is going through school. So avoid the ideologies. go to Christ. But it is frustrating because there's not necessarily systematic philosophy that you can build around that.
That's what I was kind of trying to say is that, I guess maybe it's just with our particular training on the historical apologetic, that I can't answer metaphysical questions apart from what I know about them, because the God, who created all things has told me about them. And I know that only because he entered the world and spoke about them. And then you get to the historical method and you say, well, how do you know that he entered the world? And you can start, going to the eyewitness accounts and what he said about himself and the fulfilled prophecy and the perform and the miracles and the resurrection from the dead. And you can do all that. And but that's how I know it. So, and because I now know that, right, and have the historical background for understanding that, postulating regarding metaphysical questions outside of that is sort of sometimes just feels like maybe an interesting conversation, but a useless endeavor because you have some answers already.
Right. But even with even the historical argument though, which again is what allowed me to do philosophy in terms of just being okay with it, I realized in terms of getting back to this whirlpool idea that within the epistemology that goes along with the historical argument in terms of testimony, social epistemology, historicity, and what that means, there are endless questions and endless thoughts and endless arguments being had where, barring Hume on his argument against miracles, even just the philosophy of testimony and what that means to testify to something is a rabbit hole that will take you so deep that you will lose your grounding.
Yeah.
Your feet will get thrown up in the air, right?
Yeah, I've heard some of that.
It's
disheartening.
It's crazy. Yeah. And you're looking at it going, wow, these are really smart people and these are really good arguments, right? I can poke holes here, here, and here, but that doesn't get me outside of the major problem of, say, whether a testimony can be reliable at all,
Yeah.
right? However...
Although I guess I'd argue back, we all operate on them every single day.
Right.
So to discuss their utter, unreliability also gets to be just ridiculous because these are things we operate on them every single day.
But here's a good place to show how philosophy and theology can work together, right? So even as a student suffering through this discipline, it was so vitally important that the church that I was a part of faithfully preached
the gospel of
promise,
Christ Jesus, yeah.
Christ crucified, and put him into my mouth. Because again, without a church, without a theology that is strongly sacramental in that way, that is constantly reaffirming my senses and my mind that it's real, I can get lost in these arguments of testimony till the cows come home, right? But on Sunday morning when it's proclaimed to me, and it's like, oh my God, yes, that's right? That's where that faith part, it's true, right? And I can go off and argue, and I can think through these again, and I get. It's not so much that I'm going to trust it's not like a fideist type move, but it's that almost like that existential assurance that Christ did die for me, that then I can go out and regain the battle, restart the fight, and get into these arguments, and my feet have been grounded. I'm not lost in the whirlpool, right? My faith was never in danger because the theology that led to the worship was tight. And if that wasn't,
trouble. That
would have been trouble.
Well, that's like on perfect time to end and the perfect subject matter to wrap this up. So thank you for that, Dan. That's like what we're always trying to do with this show is in all of the subject matter that we do, kind of bring things back to Christ and hopefully lead people to go to churches that continually preach to them, that help them through whatever it may be. Thank you for listening to this show. If you enjoyed this conversation, there's plenty more to go find on our website, thinkingfellows.com, or through our entire catalog that you can subscribe to via iTunes, the Google Play Store if you use Android, or any of the third-party podcasting apps that are available. Subscribing makes it so that we get more support, visibly on our statistics. I can see how many listeners there are in a more substantial way when people subscribe. But it also makes things easier for you because you won't forget to go get an episode, or if there's something with a web page or internet access, podcasts and their apps download passively in the background when you're not paying attention, so that the next time you want to go listen, it's just there for you already. Once again, thank you for listening to this show, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.